Okay, welcome everybody to our sixth episode of the SFU Sports Analytics Virtual Seminar Series. Today we're pleased to have Dr. Jonathan Tremblay and Kevin Aizen from the Université de Montréal to talk about performance analytics in ice hockey examples from their lab. Dr. Tremblay is an associate professor in the School of Kinesiology and Exercise Science at the Université de Montréal, where he also completed his PhD. His background is in exercise physiology, energy metabolism, and strength and conditioning. Kevin Aizen is completing his master's degree at the Université de Montréal in exercise science, where he previously completed his bachelor degree in kinesiology. He is interested in sports analytics, biomechanics, sport performance, and rehabilitation. He also works with developing athletes as a strength and conditioning coach. So one of the unique aspects about today's talk is that we have speakers who are more from the exercise science and sports science side rather than the statistics side, but they are now crossing into the sports analytics arena. So this is, this aligns well with sort of my background. So I'm really much looking forward to seeing or to hearing what they have to say. Now, in terms of what they will talk about, ice hockey is a sport which requires unique skills and physical abilities. Professional players also have to maintain performance throughout a season of more than 80 games, with sometimes multiple games per week. From drafting to retirement, many decisions can be made to improve day-to-day performance and career outcomes for players. This presentation will highlight some of the work done in our lab. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tremblay, who I see there. So please share your screen and look forward to your talk. Welcome, Jonathan and Kevin. Okay, I think you're still on mute there, Jonathan. Okay,
yep.
Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah.
And if I press play like this, can you see that?
Yeah, perfect.
All right. Okay, well, thank you, Dave, for the invitation. This is, I guess an uncommon group for me and for my group, for my students. We're more around sports science with regard to biomechanics or exercise physiology. And by the way, you might have to excuse my accent, my French accent. You know, we speak mostly in French in Quebec. So, I get to practice my English quite often. So I guess I'm not that bad, but I might have some weird wording sometimes or weird pronunciation. So just to give you an overview, so myself, I'm trained as a physiologist, as Dave, and I mostly study bioenergetics and substrate metabolism during prolonged exercise. But also, like in the past 10 years, I've worked as a sports scientist with the Quebec Institute of Sport, and I always thought that when I was working there, I was the director of sports science there for 5 years, and I thought that the traditional fields such as physiology and psychology, biomechanics, were really overrepresented in the support staff. And there were never anybody from performance analysis or sport analytics. And that was a flaw, I thought, at the time. And then I tried to change that over the years, but the philosophy and the ideas would not change that quickly. So I first dabbled into sport analytics while consulting for some sports. First time, I guess, with synchronized swimming and short track speed skating. And that was maybe 12 years ago, 8 years ago, sorry. And at that time, my idea was that we were testing athletes. You know, as a physiologist, I was always asked to test athletes, test their physical capacities, test their capacity to do work. But we never have measures of performance on the field. So the only measures of performance on the field we had were during competitions. And in amateur sports, competitions are not so frequent. So sometimes they might have a competition or 4 or 5 competitions in a year, and that's it. And those are our only benchmarks to which we can try to adjust the training. So it's very hard to try to, optimize training and planning based on only those 4 or 5 measurements. So my boss at the time did not allow me also to work with professional sports. So I did not work at all with professional sports, even though if I had some contacts and some questions with especially ice hockey. So I left the institute after 5 years and came back to the university to have more freedom and do whatever I wanted. And I started to work more a bit with ice hockey at that time, mostly around testing and interpreting combined results, trying to help the scouts find meaningful information for potential drafts. And so this was all new to me because I'm not from ice hockey myself. I'd never played. So this was all new. So we first started there, and it was my first exploration into ice hockey, understanding the sport, understanding the demands of the sport. And so I looked at the literature at the time, and I saw that there were some studies, for example, showing that there's one study from Jamie Burr and Ronnie Jamnik, for example, that it suggested that body size by position and the standing long jump at the NHL Combine were good predictors of the drafting round. But there were no studies that actually tried to see if this translated the performance on the ice after they were drafted. Because we know that some players are drafted but are not necessarily performing as expected on the ice afterwards. So I wanted to learn more about this data. So I looked at some online data, so some hockey reference data that I scraped. So I scraped all the data from 1984, so more than 14,000 samples at the time, 1976 players. I removed the goalies, and I tried to look at if there was a relationship between the performance measures, which were goals and assists, and the games played. And the average time on ice and the season total of time played. So this was a really naive exploration, I have to admit. And at the time, it was interesting for me to see that from all those 1976 players, 1,976 players, only 350 players remained when I actually merged the data sets and with the NHL Combine and the on-ice NHL data sets or games data set. So I started to do some naive exploration of the association, and it was not really interesting at the time. And I realized that there was not a lot of relationship other than the really obvious ones. So for example, we know that, for example, in one data set, in the NHL Combine data set, there's a relationship between peak power at the wind gate, which is a maximum anaerobic power test, which they perform on the bike, maximum power they can sustain over 30 seconds, and body mass, which is just related to muscle size. It's a proxy for muscle size. And again, if you look on the hockey data set, there were some obvious relationship on points per season and the time on ice per season. So the more time on ice you spend, the more chances you have to score points. So this was fairly obvious, and those were the easy ones to find out. And so there was not that much relationship actually between the two, though. If I wanted to analyze the relationship between off ice and on ice, I could not see anything meaningful. So it's really, while discussing with the staff at the Montreal Canadiens and discussing with other strength coaches at the time, we really questioned, does off ice testing as it's currently administered provide meaningful information to teams? And at the time, we also consulted with the NHL to try to improve the testing a little bit, to have more specificity in the testing. Because, for example, they used to do a bench press test with a fixed frequency, with a metronome. So they have to fit a frequency. And this does not make sense because you're not measuring power at all for the upper body. And it was the same thing for an upper body pull-up test. So, and in sport, most of the time you want raw power, you want power production to be evaluated. So they changed these tests, and they're changing as, you know, every year a little bit. But so this was one of the questions that we had based on this NHL Combine data. So I wanted to find more information. So more information that could be helpful to take decisions, to improve the decision-making by the administration and by the staff. So I looked in other sports, and at the time, this was almost, a bit less than 10 years ago, many sports like soccer, rugby were using sensors, and basketball was also doing it. So using IMUs and GPS to measure accelerations on the court, and also measure displacement on the court, so spatial temporal information on the court. So this was interesting, but the league did not allow to do this, or they were not aware at the time that we could possibly do this. The hockey is always a bit behind on these technology fronts. So, but I thought that this could complement the data that we have from testing and complement some of the training data that we have in the weight room as well that we collect on a weekly basis. So based on our discussions with the Montreal Canadiens, we convinced them to buy the Catapult IMUs. And these IMUs at the time had new algorithms that were able to compute the on-ice load, so the player load, the loading metrics of during games and during practice are specific to ice hockey, so on-ice load and on-ice load per minute. And so we used them for both the Montreal Canadiens for practice, because we actually used it for the first exhibition match of the season, and then the league actually said that we're not allowed to use this. They're going to implement something eventually that's going to be much better and much more interesting. So, and up to this time, we don't have the data for that. So as Danny alluded to last 2 weeks ago, so we still don't have that type of information. But now we were able to do it in practice. And in the AHL, in the American Hockey League, we could do it in games as well. So we actually decided with the Laval Rockets to use it in games and in practice. And that was our study group for one of the studies that we did. But just to give you a bit of background on how Catapult did this specific metric for ice hockey. So they actually took about 19,000 samples, video samples of skating strides, and they labeled all these videos, all these data, all these acceleration time points in their data set. And then they used random forest, and they tried to predict linear skating and crossover sections to identify strides, individual strides in players. And then they developed these specific metrics for ice hockey that were built on these algorithms for specific to ice hockey. So we decided to do a pilot study first, because we weren't sure of the validity of these metrics in professional ice hockey, because this study or this validation, this algorithm building, or this when Catapult developed this, they did this with a varsity team in the United States. So the level is really different than what we have at the professional level in Montreal or in Laval. So we decided it would be a good exploration to actually do something similar with a varsity team in Montreal. So we did this with the Carabins. Carabins is the female hockey team at the Université de Montréal. And they're pretty good. They won the national championships a few times, but it's very different again, because it's women's hockey. Intensity is very different. We wanted to see, can we implement this and try to track the players over a season, during matches and during games? And so we tried to, over a full season, try to identify during 17 games with 22 players, we had 400,000 skating strides, and we had 3,400 on-ice presence. And it was a first exploration. So first, we wanted to determine, can we identify shifts, for example, in the game automatically? Because this is not done by default by the software. So we built some simple algorithms to try to identify shifts during the game, and looking at the distribution of strides, for example, during shifts or during plays on the ice for each players. We thought that maybe asymmetries in strides over time could be something interesting to try to understand fatigue, or to try to understand its occurrence, or the depreciation or diminishing performance over time. So we did some exploration. I'm just going to show a few of those here, that mostly those that were published. So we then brought this experience and tried to do the same, kind of a same descriptive study with 50 players in the AHL, so in the American Hockey League with the Laval Rockets. So we had 50 players, because there are 25 players on a team, but they're frequent switch. So they're being drafted in and out of the team. So so we had a total of 50 players in our data set over 28 weeks, 76 games, 63 training sessions. So more than 3,000 player sessions were there. We split the data, or we had the data labeled with the position, the player position. And then we tried to look at the data also based on match day -1, and match day or days previous to matches, to try to see what does the distribution of load look like over these periods with regard to games and to the whole season. So we looked at the absolute on-ice load. So the on-ice load, or the player load, for those that are not familiar, is a proxy for work, the amount of work that is completed by an athlete. So the longer the training session, the more there's a probability that he does a lot of work over the session, and the higher intensity is sustained over a long time, the more work is actually completed. Whereas the on-ice load per minute is an average intensity of the training session or the period. So we looked at this per player position during games, and this was published last January in the Journal of Strength Conditioning Research. And so when we look at the absolute data, we could see that there's not that much of a difference between player position for on-ice load, and for on-ice load per minute, which is a proxy for intensity. We see that the defensemen typically have a slightly lower intensity than the wingers and the centers over the whole season. Now, we also tried to look at the, so this was actually interesting at the beginning, because we thought, well, this information could maybe provide reference values by position and actually individual values in order to help in the return to play process when an athlete is injured. We know that we can get him back to a certain level of play, a certain level of intensity that he can sustain without risking too much of an injury, because that's a typical level of play in the game. So that was informative. And as I said, like we realized that the defenseman had a lower playing intensity in general. We then looked at the on-ice load, but relative to the game average by position for the 3 periods of play in a game. So on-ice load and on-ice load per minute with 3 periods of play during the game. And we see some obvious things that, in the first period, the intensity or the load is much higher than in the second 2 periods. But the intensity does not change that much. It's actually lower in the 3rd period in general. And we saw as well that the defensemen seemed to perform a lot more work, or significantly more work in the 1st period compared to the other positions, compared to the centers and the wingers. So that was also interesting for us to try to understand what was going on during the games. So those are the 2 points that I highlighted. And we looked at training days leading to a game, so which corresponds to match day 0 here. This is game day. There were some practice sessions on game day they're sometimes called morning skates. So we noticed that the on-ice load, the training load on general, is 30 to 40% lower in practice than in games, because this is all relative to games. So 0% corresponds to a game, a typical game. So the load in a practice is typically lower than a game. So that's interesting. And even lower on game day, which is about 70% lower than game day. The on-ice load, we realized that the on-ice load per minute, was about 5 to 15% lower in games, and that the defensemen had a slightly lower decrease. So they have only a 5% decrease in intensity in games, in practice compared to games, So defensemen seem to have a more stable on-ice load per minute and intensity during games and during practice. They're solicited in the same fashion in these different contexts. So that was interesting for us. And this cannot be necessarily generalized to all the other teams. This was just one season with one coach, with one team, with a bunch of players playing under that coach. So we realized that from this that both the amount of work and the intensity that the players output never actually reflects the demands of the game. So that was interesting for us, because we thought, normally when you train an athlete for performance, you have to actually have a higher intensity than the game sometimes, or high intensity than the actual performance, or try to reach a higher amount of work in order to build for that capacity to perform at the best level on game day. So we have to overload sometimes to be able to bring adaptations. But we know also that in many sports such as soccer and rugby, typically during the week which precedes a game, there's normally a taper. So we see normally a decrease in the amount of work per day leading to the game day. And we see in ice hockey in this group here, we didn't have any variation. So the 4 days preceding the game or game day, there was actually not much variation in player load or on ice load or in on ice load per minute. So the intensity is pretty much the same all the time. On ice load is pretty much the same all the time as well, except for game day where the morning skate is a bit lower. This also highlighted one interesting point for us, is that we realized that the morning skates that were performed, so they performed over season 35 morning skates over 76 matches. And in these morning skates, typically they have about 35% of the game load. So a much lower load. But if you add up all this load over all the morning skate in the season, it corresponds to an additional 12 games that are played in the season, which is already really busy. So it was a question we had, are these morning skates necessary? Because in other sports, again, this is not a common practice to have a morning practice before the game all the time. So these were just things that we realized were interesting based on our observations with this group. And then the last thing we looked at with this in this paper is that we looked at the training distribution over the whole season. And again, noticing that the distribution is fairly even over the whole season. There's not that much change in the player load or the cumulative weekly load per week relative to matches. So it corresponds to about a 4 matches per week, which is fairly heavy, except for the month of February where they had the All-Star break. It's pretty even all over. So it's a pretty heavy season that these guys have to go through. And this just actually reflected that. But we thought that maybe if we could better use maybe the opponent's ranking or the expected competitiveness of the opponent team, maybe we could use this to add variation in the planning, allowing for more cycles of recovery and performance, and maybe in this way improving performance on the games that are really important. Now I'm going to show you some other stuff that we did as well, and I'm going to let it to Kevin, who's going to show his project. So we also tried to look at some of the self-reported, so subjective measures of wellness across the season. So the players in the Laval Rocket had to fill out a questionnaire every day, a small questionnaire, and they had to rate their hours of sleep, sleep quality, nutrition, quality of rest, pain, and stress. And we were compiling those over the season, and we realized that it was actually interesting to notice that the quantity and quality of sleep is lower on game day, which is not necessarily something that's a big surprise. But we also realized that sleep quality, it just confirms what we already know, impacts wellness. So nutrition, sleep, pain, and stress combined together. So this is, again, goes along the recommendations that are done around sleep and performance, and how teams should value sleep and improve recovery for the players to maximize performance. We also looked at was there a difference between home games versus visiting games when they're going away? And we noticed that it actually had no impact. The location of the game had no impact on sleep quantity or quality. So this was other stuff that we did. Now I'm gonna stop right now because I think I've done about 20 minutes, if I'm correct. And I'm gonna leave it out to Kevin, and I can show a bit more maybe afterwards if we have time. But Kevin is gonna show some of the stuff that he did with junior hockey players and trying to predict performance on the ice while experimenting, again, dabbling with machine learning, and try to see if it could be useful or playing with these tools in ice hockey. So Kevin.
So I'll just jump in, Jonathan. Thank you very much. Sure. It's a fascinating first part. There is a question from Alon. So question regarding training intensities. They seem lower than games, but that's during a season, which as you've shown is very busy, 4 games per week. Have you checked preseason and summer sessions to see how the intensities then translate?
Oh, well, the first season when we did this, we didn't do it, but afterwards we did. And I could say that the preseason, sometimes intensity is really, really hard, but it's only for a week or two, so it's really brief. So, and I could, one of the students, one of my students, PhD students, is actually on this group now, and he's actually looking at this data with the Montreal Canadiens, so we could actually talk about this in more detail. Pierre Allard is working for the Montreal Canadiens, and he's on this group right now. So he could explain a bit more of this, or reply to that question a bit better than I would.
Okay, Pierre, if you're there, do you want to jump in?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan, for your presentation. So, yeah, well, obviously the preseasons are really tough on the players. We do monitor the load, the player load, and the intensity for training camp, but we didn't put it in this paper because it was essentially just a rocket season, and most of the players, not all the players, but most of the players participate to the Montreal training camps, but we're not allowed to use those data to publish in a paper because the data belongs to the Montreal Canadiens team. But having said that, the load during training camp, especially in the NHL, it's pretty high because they on the second day of the training camp they already playing games, so the load is pretty high for that group.
And maybe, Pierre, what I could add is that, informative for you guys that might be working with some hockey teams is that we actually noticed that, like in any sport, but the coaches sometimes are not familiar with the concept of loading. And so often when the players come to a camp after a break or after training on their own, the coaches right away, increase the load really quickly. And as you might know, increasing load quickly is the highest, risk for injury. And so this might not be the best choice, to actually increase load really quickly in the first few days or in the first week of a training camp. So maybe having a more progressive load increase would be better. So yeah, we've seen that it's sometimes been increased too fast, too quickly.
Perfect. Oh, go ahead, Pierre.
No, I was just going to say that what we noticed in the NHL is like the first 5 days, I think, of the training camp and the exhibition games. It looks like players sometimes would have played 5 games in the first 5 days. So this is something that we revisit. I said last year we adjust to the training load for the players, and especially with the phase 2 and phase 3 before they joined the bubble in Toronto. That was a part of the discussion. So now we're getting there as a group and working with coaches and the whole medical staffs all together, and using the data that we collect and the paper that we publish to be more efficient on the training load for the players when we start the season.
It's fascinating stuff. Thanks a lot, Pierre. So maybe that was, I guess, part of Montreal's magic last night for that big win against Philly, eh? Okay, so Alon, hopefully that answers your question. There's another question from Dr. Ben Sporer. He says, "Great work, Jonathan. For the game day loads,
hey,
did you include warm-up in your calculation of total load?"
Pierre, can you remind me of that? I don't think we did include warm-up in this study.
No, we excluded warm-up. There's one of the reason is the catapult unit. They only last for between 2.5 and 3 hours of battery, and if we what we tried with the Caribbean, the girls varsity team, and if we start the units for warm-up just 5 minutes before warm-up, they don't last for the whole game. So that was one of the reasons that we exclude warm-up from the data.
Excellent, thank you. That's really interesting because you talk about the morning skates, but those warm-ups aren't short either, and you can imagine how much. Like, do you guys have an estimate of how much extra load that the warm-ups themselves are causing?
It's depend on the players. There's players with that's I think that's the part that we saw as the most variation in the data, because some guys barely move during warm up. They don't do that much. Some others they need to do more to get ready for the game. So there's a lot of fluctuation in the numbers.
Oh, very, very interesting. Okay, well, so just one last, hopefully quick question then. What about the, the off-ice conditioning and strength and conditioning and stuff like that? I mean, how much are they doing? And I suspect during the season, there's lots of traveling and everything too, which would interrupt it. But can you comment on the relative amount of load practice versus off-ice activities?
Yeah, well, it's hard to compute because we have off-ice load, but the off-ice load is not measured in the same way. So off-ice load, typically we measure it, during using different metrics. So of power output that produced in different exercises, using different devices that we can measure. And we also have subjective assessments of off-ice load or training load in strength conditioning sessions. But we don't show this information here, and there's another paper that's going to be coming out soon, hopefully, which will use a bit more information or combine a bit more of these data sets. But right now, it's yeah, I can just tell you that we've looked at it, but it's very difficult to actually combine both in a whole data set, or in my experience anyway. So. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All right, great. Thank you very much. I guess, Kevin, are you ready to, and please share your screen?
I'll stop mine, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So how you hear me?
I can hear you and I can see your background, yeah.
Good. All right. Okay, so thanks to the organization of Simon Fraser University for letting me present my paper today. The paper is still in fine-tuning process and will soon be submitted to the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. My research supervisor are Jonathan Tremblay and Michael Begon, both from the Université de Montréal. And as an ex-hockey player myself, I was interested in this project because I want to learn about machine learning and to apply it in the real-world sport context. So I tried to predict the skating speed performance of youth elite hockey player with the use of lower limb isometric strength test. So what physical qualities are important for hockey player? Well, a lot. Previous studies showed that typical professional player will perform approximately 20 sprints in a game for an average distance of 26 meters. And he'll do in average 1 sprint per shift. Also, for each minute played during game time, he'll make 4 to 10 high intensity bursts like short acceleration or quick change of direction covering 15 to 26 meters. So that can explain why scouts generally highly value skating ability when recruiting players, such as maximal sprinting and acceleration. And these capabilities are known to require high level of lower limb strength and power, and especially at the hip joint. But unfortunately, other than vertical jump and agility testing, not much of the NHL combine and typical tests include testing around the hip. So 4 components of physical capabilities could be associated with skating speed. We have lower limb explosive power, cycling power, running sprint speed, and maximal strength test. However, strength tests show inconsistent correlation depending on the protocol used, and no consensus has been made on which protocol should be used. These tests are also hard to perform on a large group because it necessitates a long familiarization protocol and knowledge of the movement beforehand. So it implies a high logistical cost. And then we need a new strength test to better suit for our busy schedule. So based on this, the result of the previous study, it remained difficult to have a clear link between off-ice and on-ice tests due to a lack of specificity between these tests. And this must be said also that the culture of hockey requires us to conduct off-ice tests, even though if they are irrelevant. So with the growing interest of analytics in sport field, we could use machine learning algorithm to predict skating speed performance. and they could also give more accurate prediction than the previous reported linear regression. Okay, so with that information, our proposal were to train a linear and nonlinear regression model to predict skating speed with the off-ice assessment that we just saw, except that we use isometric strength tests for maximal strength capacity. This type of tests are easy and quick to perform. They also provide a truer value of maximal strength capacity, and they show to be related to field sprint on rugby and soccer players. We also want to illustrate the importance of all off-ice features on the model output, and the result could help team sport coaching staff to point out weaknesses of individual athletes and work on that to improve performance. This can also help scouts to identify talent with off-ice test results, since on-ice tests are rarely used in hockey testing combine. So to do that, we were inviting on the testing day involving youth hockey players considered a future prospect of Quebec Junior Major Hockey League. Players participate in off-ice and on-ice tests led by an external company called Okanagan Hockey, and they provide us results on all tests. Our goal was to predict straight line skating speed in both directions, so forward and backward. That include acceleration phase on 5 meter and speed phase on the 25 meter, and also the 30-meter sprint. So here's a short video of the forward sprint. So you can see the splitting gate on the 5 meter. Sorry for the lag. Here we go. And on all off-ice tests done, we select those who found the best relationship with skating speed. Anthropometric data, so height and body mass, and novel isometric hip strength tests were also had as our feature. So this is the hip strength test using the growing bar from Vault Performance, which use load cell to measure isometric force. Participants performed 2 maximal voluntary isometric contractions, so with 5-second break between repetition. There were tests in 6 different positions, so in random order. So we had hip adduction, abduction, external and internal rotation, as well as flexion and extension. So here's a little video for the test. No sound. So it's isometric. Okay. The median force was computed for each trial to eliminate aberrant peak force in the signals, and we only use the best trial for both limbs. We compute a normalized force, the F scores, which penalize non-symmetric force production. We also calculate an imbalance scores as a percentage to assess symmetries in force production. And all these variables were used as our feature for our model. Okay, so the model we used were multiple linear regression and lasso CV from scikit-learn library as our linear model. Multiple linear regression served as a baseline model, and lasso CV was used to penalize weak predictors. We also experimented with the extreme gradient boosting from XGBoost library without hyperparameter optimization. We choose the XGBoost model because of its popularity and somewhat easier interpretability. We split our data of 72 players and put 80% of them in a training set and 20% in the testing set. And also we use a 10K-fold cross-validation on the training set to exploit the whole data set and improve generalization of the models. Regression coefficient and Shapley additive explanation were used to interpret which feature have the highest impact on the model output for linear model and XGBoost respectively. Finally, we use root mean square error and mean absolute percentage error as model performance metric for all models. Also, R-square was used for linear model. So this is our predictions on testing sets for each output variable. On the left, we see the root mean square error, and on the right, the mean absolute percentage error. The lowest error was obtained for forward speed variable, both here. So flying 25 meter sprint and 30 meter sprint. Model prediction error were not significantly different for any output variable, so each model predict skating speed with similar error. However, Lasso CV had the lower end prediction error for each output variable. And if we look at the explained variance of the Lasso CV model on the testing set, we see that R-squared dropped negative for all output variables except the 530 and 30S. That means that the model fails generalization on new data, and the mean horizontal line performed better than our Lasso CV model for all variables except 530 and 30S. Okay, here's our graph for the feature importance of XGBoost on the left and Lasso CV on the right. So as an example for XGBoost, let's take the 30B variable for 30 meter backward sprint. If we look at the flex for hip flexion, so having a high hip flexion strength in red will have a negative impact on the 30B time. Instead, if we look at the IMB-X for imbalance in hip extension, having a low hip extension imbalance in blue will have a negative impact. So here. So to be clear, when I said negative impact, that means a shorter time on the sprint. So it's a good thing for the player. Also, if we look at the curve of IMB-X, we see that it's not really wide. So that means that it had a little impact on the 30B variable. So we want a wide curve like our flex predictor like this. This is good. Overall, SLG for standing long jump and flex were the most important predictor on both models. SLG was important for acceleration and 30-meter sprint, while flex had more importance for the speed variables, so 530 and 30 meters. Okay, so what did we learn about our result? First is that forward speed variables show good prediction, and this is shown by a smaller error message compared to the standard deviation of the group. Second, we see that Lasso CV gives better prediction for all output variables. The interpretation of feature importance is also much easier, and the model remains parsimonious because we only optimize the alpha parameter for the amount of penalization. And finally, its strength in flexion was a good overall predictor for skating speed variable in both directions. And this makes sense since hip flexor acts as a stabilizer and are highly solicited in the recovery phase after the pushing phase. As you can see in the short GIF, so right here we see that the flexion of the hip. And lower limb power was also a great predictor, and especially the standing long jump, which is more horizontal applied power. And power is known to reflect the ability of the player to generate high amount of force during the push phase of the skating. So for practical application, model can be used to predict skating speed performance based on a subset of combined testing, so the off-ice test done. Some tests could be removed if they don't provide additional information. Coaches, organization, or even scouts could then estimate player capacity based on the subset of predictor. And strength and conditioning coach can then optimize its innovation and prioritize physical capabilities for individual athletes. Future recommendations should be to standardize the testing across various leagues to get larger data sets containing a more valid and reliable measurement. We also can reduce dimensionality to avoid multicollinearity or group athletes. That will limit the amount of feature and minimize the complexity. And finally, it could be a good idea to do an innovation study to test the applicability of the model used. We can ask ourselves, would improving hip flexion strength be associated with an improvement in skating performance? So thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. Is there any questions for Kevin before we continue on?
Hey, Dave, can I ask a question?
Please.
Can you hear me, Kevin?
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Oh, sorry, my audio cut out. Sorry, Kevin, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, great. Very nice presentation. Thanks a lot. I was curious about your ML methodology. You said you did an 80-20 split and you did a 10-fold cross-validation. Is the 10-fold only on the 80 for parameter tuning?
I didn't do some hyperparameter tuning.
You didn't tune, okay. And so no. you did 10-fold on the outer loop for generalization?
Yeah, only on the training set.
I guess I'm just confused. Like, did you have a single test set of 20%, or did you?
Yeah, the training set is about 80%, and I did a 10K fold cross validation on the training set.
Okay, so you only had a single test set of the 20%, which are what all of these metrics are reported.
Yeah. So on the slides, if I understand your question, these are the testing sets. So these are the 15, okay. The remaining 15 player.
Okay. I was just curious. No, thank you. That clarifies things. I was just curious if you had done some sort of cross validation on the outer loop, whether or not these results would be any different, because maybe you got unlucky on this 15, or possibly lucky on the 15 people. So that just something to consider.
Yeah, thank you. I could try this. Yes. I don't. I use this on training set, but yes, I could do this on the other loop, like you said.
Okay, thanks. Anyway, overall, I thought the work was really interesting and a very. I see a lot of research where people are trying to force machine learning onto something, but this seems like actually a really well-motivated application of machine learning. So I congratulate you guys on this work.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. If anyone else has a question, please just chime in by voice. Okay.
Kevin, it's Ian Schreier. On the last slide, you talked about how much additional information is provided with each of the tests, but I missed it during the talk. So, how much additional information did the hip flexion or those? I mean, did you do that analysis, or it's just future work?
Oh yeah, it's for future work. So it could be a good idea to do a post-innervation study to test if actually the if flexure, if an improvement in hip flexion strength could add an improvement on the testing on the sprinting time, and validate with our model if it's the case.
Okay, so if that answers your question, Ian, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Tremblay and thank Kevin very much for his presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And just to add that, this is the first exploration for Kevin in machine learning. So there's still some, it's an application of something we actually already did with the synchronized swimming. And we applied it to hockey, so it might be, there's still some tuning to be done to improve this. So for sure, we're still working on that.
Okay, so Jonathan, do you have, so we're at almost 11 o'clock right now.
Oh.
Is there anything else?
Oh, you wanted me to share something else, or?
Well, if you're...
I thought that was pretty much the time we had, so.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. So we can end there, and what we'll do is we'll take additional questions maybe for about 5 minutes, and then I'll stop the recording, and then we can have, if you guys are available, Jonathan and Kevin, for extended discussion with anyone who wants to just connect offline. Hopefully you can spend a few more minutes after that.
Sure.
So I'll open it up to the audience to ask any additional questions. So please just unmute yourself and ask away. And while we're waiting, I actually had a question. So what is the predictivity of the skating tests on ice performance? So you've got tracking data, presumably of velocities that you've computed from the positional data. And have you tried to, or do you have a data set where you have the skating speed and acceleration testing as predictors of on-ice performance? And by extension, could you, instead of using a skating test data, use actual skating performance data from games and then use that to see if the tests are predictive of actual in-game performance?
Maybe that's something I forgot to mention, Dave, but we don't have positional data for ice hockey. So right now we only have the acceleration of the players on the ice, but there are no antennas around the rink in order to measure position or velocity. Yeah. Right.
So the catapult is just the IMU then?
Just the IMU. So we just installed this year the antennas in our training rink, but it's not available for matches, and it wasn't for the previous years. So
I see. Okay, thanks for that.
Yeah, but this this is something we'd like to look at for sure. Trying to. I think from my perspective, I'd like to have more information of what's done on the ice, and try to remove as much information or remove some of the testing that we do off the ice. I think if we can be just as transparent as possible and just measure whatever we can in a training session off ice and on ice, I think eventually maybe we could remove the need for testing, if we have good information. But right now it's not the case, and it's part of the culture as well. So we'll see how that evolves over time.
Right. So that's really interesting. So can you expand on the cultural aspect? How is this going to take a generational change for coaches and team staff to not? It just seems kind of bewildering to me that I'm sort of heartened in one sense, because that means that they actually appreciate science. But on the other hand, if you have scientists telling you that there may be a better way, then maybe you ought to listen to them. I don't know.
Well, it's funny, because they hire scientists to give them advice, but when we tell them what they don't want to hear, they don't like it, So if you tell them that they don't need testing, they'll say, well, I won't hire you then. But we tell them there's something better than testing, then they'll say, no, we want testing. So you're like, okay, well, so we do the testing, So, and also, it's expected by the media. It's a cultural thing, every year the combine is something that's really big. Even though, we don't necessarily use this a lot, for training, we try to use a lot more information outside of the combine. But the information that's outside of the combine is also really subjective because it's based on scouts. And so it's you have to be careful in interpreting that. So whereas this testing information is a bit more objective, but as I said earlier, it's not necessarily standardized. So we don't necessarily have large data set of the similar tests that were done. The tests change, the procedures change, administration of the test change. So it's hard to actually interpret some of this data. And as you know, I think there's a bias as a physiologist. Some of the testing were done by physiologists in order to test more than to measure performance. And more to understand physiology than to actually improve performance. So I think that's something that's changing slowly, but it's still present in the culture even around sports science and professional sport in general.
Yes, yeah, there are definitely those cultural elements as well that the scientists themselves bring. Can certainly cause some issues. Right on. Okay.
To give you an example, in the combine, they've recently added force plates to measure the vertical jump. But they added those force plates with a lot of metrics based on the force plates. But you can measure a lot of things with force plates, but how meaningful is it to actual performance on the ice? It's not necessarily clear. So it's there's examples like this, where they've just added data, but added data just to have data. It's not necessarily data that's going to be useful for us anyway.
Was it decision ever? I think probably the culture is more is better on whatever metric, but would that actually sway a decision? These individual data points, on some obscure metric from a force plate.
Yeah.
Jonathan,
I'd be somebody
Ian.
smart. Hey, Ian, how are you?
I'm doing well. I have a question for you. Somebody was asking about load and the warm-up. I'm curious if you've thought about how to deal with that. I mean, the morning skates are clearly not warm-up, so they're load.
Yeah.
But warm-up has important physiological benefits. So if you just mix it up with, well, if it's done
it can
properly.
also hinder performance, right?
Right. So because you have those two things where you can have the fatigue, but you also rev up the muscle engines. Have you thought about how you might be able to split that up or deal with it in an analysis? Is there any ideas that you have there?
I think it's a good point. You know, we could try to look at warm up and try to individualize and optimize warm up for by position or by player. Right now, it's not the case. They're all professional players and they have their own schedules. It's not necessarily structured, the warm up. You know, I think they do their own stuff a little bit, and then they have kind of a general warm up, which is very general. It's not. Some players are not doing much, and some are doing more than others. So for sure, that this could be something that we could explore, but so far we haven't played with that. We haven't put time into this. No. But it's a good point. I think it's something that meaningful. It's also not a lot of time, you know. So the warm up is typically fairly small compared to the morning skate, for example. So it's a smaller fraction of the work that they do in a day. But and also I didn't mention, but there's there's warm up, but there's actually post practice work as well, because some players stay on the ice after practice and do additional work. And this was not computed as well. So, and it doesn't happen all the time, but some players always do this. And so this is additional work that could be contributing, you know, to some factor to fatigue or whatever, what have you.
Jonathan, it's Paul Dortich here. Hey, thanks for that great presentation. I was curious about, you made a comment about load and the coaching staff not necessarily knowing how and when to ramp it up, particularly as athletes come into the first training camp. I'm curious to know how much monitoring and guidance is being provided to the athletes well before they even get to training camp in terms of their preparation. So are they coming in at a high enough level that they can handle that increase in load?
I think Pierre would be better to answer to this, but he just left. He has to be on the ice actually at this time, so he's not available. But I can tell you from my understanding, my experience is that, it's really individual. So each player comes in, and we don't necessarily control what the players do in the off season, right? Because they're free on their time. They have their own trainer, their own coaches. And when they come to Montreal or to Brossard or a training center, there's a lot of variability. Some players might, suddenly they've gained 15 pounds or 20 pounds. Some players are smaller and they're not as quick and are always tired. So it varies a lot by player. So loading, I think coaches in general just have an idea of what's a typical session, of what they expect from a session. And they build their sessions that they're planning mostly build on that. So they don't look at, the level of the players necessarily. They have an idea of what they want in a session. And sometimes, they tell us, I remember, during the training camps, they tell us, oh, this is really going to be an easy day today. We only have, like a short burst of intensity, 2x2, 3x3. And then we look at the load and it's actually higher than a match, so they have a really hard time understanding what is load and what is intensity in a game or in practice. Yeah. And we try to educate them around during the year, but some coaches are more open to discussion, some are less. So it's and coaches change all the time as well. So sure. It's an ongoing process. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Do you monitor SRPEs across the different training modalities?
We try, yes, we try with some players are more compliant than others, but we try to have them, actually at the beginning we were having them fill it out, but we realized that it doesn't work with professional athletes so much. So now we just ask them and we fill it out for them. And we try to monitor that, but it's, some players are not willing to participate and some others are really open to it, so it depends. I just want to mention that there's a difference between the pro players, the Montreal Canadiens, for example, and the Laval Rocket. because the Laval Rocket, you know, they want to get to the pro, right? They want to get to the NHL. So they're a lot more open to doing whatever we say. But once they're at the top, you know, they can do whatever they want. So they decide based on their own ideas.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, what's the level of interest amongst the players in understanding physiology and performance and nutrition and all the sports science stuff, and what is their capacity to understand and apply that?
Some are really curious, I think. Some are really interested in what we're doing. They're really willing to participate, and others are really doubtful. They're more they think we're going to measure things that they don't understand behind their back. You know, so for example, with the sleep, you know, the league does not allow us to measure sleep or to ask questions about sleep. So SRP is more delicate. So I guess it's easier, but it's, you know, so there's things that are evolving in the league as well, in the Players Association. So I think I think the goal for us is to show or educate the athletes and showing them that if we better understand what they're doing, we can improve their career outcomes. You know, we can improve their performance in the long run and have them play for more years, being performant for more years. The goal is not to use them, you know, to perform on a certain day. The goal is to help them in order to improve the team and improve the outcomes for the team. But it's hard to grasp sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, other questions? Okay, so I'm just going to very slowly turn off the recording here in anticipation of only maybe a handful of other post questions. So I will just conclude by thanking you, Dr. Tremblay and Kevin, for an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed the merging of sports science and sports analytics, and really look forward to seeing the data coming out of your group in the time to come. So thanks everybody for attending, and we will see you in September. We're currently scheduling the talks, and again, if you have speaker suggestions, please forward them my way. Take care, everyone.